Hello and welcome to another installment of the Weird Chronicles. Each episode, we bring you tales of action and adventure from Malifaux and the other side. In Malifaux, death is not always the end. The city's resurrectionists make a hideous art of animating corpses. But sometimes, even the most skilled necromancers must face the final curtain. I hope you enjoy the conclusion of Nemesis Part 2.
Dashiell Barker shook his head. "Nothing you just said is going to happen, Mom." Columns of dark smoke rose out of the mansion behind him, almost thick enough to obscure the moonlight. The unpleasant sense of ash, smoke, and roasting flesh had turned an otherwise pleasant night into a charnel nightmare. Had she been able to see, Lady Justice might have stared the larger guard colonel down. Instead, she stepped forward, well into his personal space, and turned her head upward to face his own. "If you do not give the order, I will personally shove you into a pine box for the rest of the month." The larger man snorted and placed his hands on his hips as he stared down at her. "You honestly think you can take me, Mom?" There wasn't so much as a tremble of doubt in Justice's voice. "Yes. Now give the order." Guardsmen and death marshals exchanged awkward glances with each other as they waited to see whether or not their respective leaders were going to come to blows. It certainly wasn't unheard of for Colonel Barker to come to blows with those who disagreed with him. But Lady Justice's reputation as a skilled sword fighter was not to be taken lightly. After a long minute, Barker snorted and turned away. "Whatever. I don't get paid enough to care either way." He raised two meaty fingers to his lips and released a shrill, ear-piercing whistle. As the assembled members of the Guild Guard turned to face him, he started shouting as loudly as his formidable voice would allow. "Listen up, you maggots. The Death Marshals want you sorry lot to charge into that flaming building and flush out the Reza that's hiding within." Lady Justice raised a hand to massage her temples as the Colonel twisted her words into the most unflattering light possible. Her partner, the judge, crossed his arms and glanced sideways at her, one eyebrow raised. "Not too late to shove him into a coffin," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. "Don't give me none of that," Barker continued, shouting down the complaints and objections of his troops. "You're guild soldiers, and guild soldiers love to fight. They love to charge into godforsaken burning buildings so that they can get eaten by some son-of-a-bitch zombie. They love burning to death so that when Lady Justice finally decides to enter combat, she can walk across their charred and burned bodies and keep her shoes from getting all fussed up by the ashes." Barker fell silent, leaving the wide-eyed faces of the men and women under his command staring up at him. He let them stare for the span of 2 heartbeats before shouting back at them, even louder than before. "Did I stutter? Get your asses in there!" As a group, the guardsmen lurched toward the mansion, many of them only pausing long enough to tie bandanas around their faces to protect them from the smoke. Dashiell was right behind them, shouting and berating the slowest guardsmen in order to keep them moving. The last one in line was a muscular woman whose arms were wrapped around the massive Gatling gun that had already sent dozens of zombies back to their graves. The judge watched them leave in silence. "Did Barker seem upset to anyone?" he finally asked, his tone amused. The death marshal nearest him shook her head in mock disagreement. "Nah, he's having a good day, I think. I didn't see him pistol whip anyone on their way into the mansion." Fair point." The judge glanced over at Justice. "Now that the dogs are doing their job and flushing out our quarry, should we rendezvous with the others?" Lady Justice reached up and fingered the hilt of the greatsword lashed to her back. "This one's evaded us for too long. It's time to end this, once and for all." Handkerchief pressed up against his mouth, Nicodem winded his way through the smoke-filled hallways of his burning mansion. His path took him into the library, where flames were already in the process of devouring his expansive collection of literature and poetry. He tried not to think about their loss as he worked his way around the fires and toward the revolving bookcase. The secret passage had already been pushed open to reveal the crude escape tunnel he had discovered shortly after he took up residence in the mansion. The steps led down into the winding sewers beneath the city. Nicodem reached for the lantern that was supposed to be hanging beside the passage, but it was absent, which forced him to walk in the darkness, one gloved hand pressed against the filth-covered wall. The lack of light was an annoyance, but years ago he had memorized the path to the nearest graveyard for just such an occasion. The guild might have destroyed the zombies in his home, but he had small caches of corpses hidden all around the city. This was only a temporary setback. Nicodem turned a corner and paused. Further down the tunnel, a group of figures stood at an intersection in the sewer tunnels. One of the figures, a short, portly fellow, was holding a lantern above his head and moving it back and forth, as if trying to discern the best of the three paths before him. As the figure turned to the right and lifted the lantern, Nicodem caught sight of his face and relaxed. "It's a left tunnel," he called out, his tone almost conversational. Mortimer jumped and wheeled around in surprise, nearly extinguishing the lantern in the process. Upon seeing Nicodem melt out of the shadows, he placed a fat hand against his chest and relaxed. "Geez, boss, you nearly exploded my ticker. Why you got to sneak up on a bloke like that?" "Perhaps because my assistant took the lantern when he fled the mansion." Nicodem motioned to the zombies, who started plodding off down the left tunnel. "I am not very pleased with you at this moment, Mortimer." Mortimer started walking backwards down the tunnel, keeping pace with the slower pack of zombies. "Can't say that it was really my fault, boss. Guilders throwing firebombs through the windows. Sounds of some sort of super gun tearing through the entryway. It was like we got dropped in the middle of a war zone. Then, before I could rightly get my feet under me, we've got guilders coming through the halls and shooting at anything that moved. Shooting at a few things that weren't moving too, for that matter. So I figured, least I could do was grab what few rotters were still intact and try to meet you at the cemetery." Nicodem waved the excuse off with a filth-covered glove. "No matter. We will replenish our forces at the graveyard, and then retreat to our mansion in the sink to plot our revenge." "The sink?" Mortimer's face screwed up into a scowl. "Hate that bloody place. Always leaves me feeling all queasy. Something about all them tilted buildings. Too quiet, too, like living in a graveyard. I know that you like that sort of thing, but right decent folks like me, we—" Mortimer's complaint-ridden chatter accompanied them the rest of the way down the tunnel. When they finally arrived at the ladder that led upwards to the cemetery, Nicodem closed his eyes and sent his senses upwards. The sensation of so many corpses resting in the ground above him, all tucked away into their graves, brought a thin smile to his face. Turning his mind away from their rotting potential, he slipped a hand into his pocket, grasped one of the soul stones there, and willed the mists to rise up from the ground overhead. Stepping back, he motioned toward the ladder with his cane. One by one, the zombies shuffled up to the ladder and began to climb it upwards into the access tube. Nicodem just waited until the last one had climbed the ladder before following suit. It was a long climb. The tunnel ran almost 20 feet below the graveyard, and the mausoleum that inexplicably contained the square sewer entrance was crowded with waiting zombies when he finally climbed to his feet. He motioned the waiting dead, commanding the one nearest the heavy stone door to push it open. Thick white fog, damp and cool where the mansion's smoke had been hot and rough, poured into the mausoleum like a cloud. Mortimer was right behind Nicodem, his constant babbling now reduced to nothing more than half-ignored background noise. "Ugh," the rounded man groaned as he tried to pull himself through the narrow hatch. "Looks like I've been putting away a bit too many fine dinners, eh?" The groan was followed by a self-deprecating laugh. "Come on, boss. Give me a hand here." With a sigh, Nicodem motioned to two of the zombies who had yet to lurch out into the graveyard. They shuffled over to Mortimer, one to either side of him, and grabbed onto his arms to pull him out of the access tunnel. "Ah, much better," Mortimer laughed as he got his feet underneath him. He patted his belly with the hand that wasn't holding the lantern. "Looks like there's just a bit too much of me to go around, eh? Explains why Seamus and the Doc are so thin, always crawling round in the sewers, up and down those ladders. Give me a good carriage any day of the week, I say." Nicodem and his zombies were already on their way out the door. The fog was so thick that the second row of gravestones was barely visible. But as Mortimer came out behind him, the light of the lantern was bright enough to dispel some of the thick vapours. The warm glow reflected like a spider web across the surface of the nearest graves, and with a look that was part confusion and part curiosity, Nicodem approached the nearest plot and knelt down beside it. Reaching out, he ran his fingers across the web of taut, sharp metal wires that had been strung out across the grave, woven between a series of metal spikes that had been pounded into the ground at its sides. A glance to either side of him confirmed that the other graves in the area had been similarly modified. Mortimer came up behind him, holding his lantern high to give Nicodem more light. "What's up, boss? Someone do something to the rotter holes?" "It's razor wire." Nicodem stood up and raised his hand. Immediately, all of the zombies froze in place, as still as statues. Even Mortimer fell silent for once. In the silence of the night, they could hear the faint sound of footsteps on dirt, the subtle swish of leather dusters across sturdy boots, and the hushed murmur of inarticulate whispers. "Extinguish the light," he hissed. "The guild is here." Mortimer hurled the lantern into the fog and hit the ground just as the gunfire began. At first, Lady Justice worried that she made a mistake. She assumed that her quarry would flee from a full frontal assault by the guild guard and attempt to replenish his losses at the nearest graveyard. When they had arrived, though, the cemetery was as still as, well, the grave. Nevertheless, she ordered her death marshals to start spiking the graves just in case. When the mist finally started to boil up from the ground, she actually breathed a sigh of relief. Her death marshals had the advantage. She wasn't certain who started shooting, but the shrouded, indistinct light of the necromancer's lantern must have given them a clear shot at the necromancer. By the time the first shell had hit the ground, she was already in motion, racing through the row of graves to close the distance between her and where the necromancer had appeared. Blind as she was, Justice didn't see the necromancer raise his hands to either side of him, but she could still feel the necromantic power he was gathering. She shouted a warning back to her people as the first of the zombies, a rotting woman with stitches running down the center of her chest, came charging out of the fog toward her. Justice fell forward into a somersault, regained her footing, and sprung up from the ground, using the momentum of her movement to carry her greatsword through the woman's chest. As she landed, she twisted the sword around and brought it down into the shoulder of a second zombie that had just shuffled out of the fog, splitting it into two pieces as the sword embedded itself a half-inch into the graveyard soil. Her head snapped up as the necromancer unleashed the power of his spell. Necromantic energy rippled through the ground like a tidal wave, washing over the buried dead and infusing them with unnatural life. Almost immediately, the corpses shattered the lids of their cheap plywood coffins and began clawing their way upwards through the loosely packed earth above them. "Gravebound incoming!" she called back. The cry was immediately echoed by the judge, who, judging from the hurried tone of his voice and its distance from her, was hurrying to her side, most likely with the rest of her death marshals right behind him. They weren't moving fast enough, though. The buried dead would be able to claw their way free of the graves in only a few moments, and then the numbers would be against them. She had to eliminate the necromancer before they lost their advantage. Before Justice could charge forward, however, another zombie appeared out of the fog. It was dressed in the soiled clothes of a miner, and carried a heavy pickaxe, which was raised above its head in preparation for an overhand strike. Justice cursed and fell back into a defensive stance, bouncing on her heels as she waited for it to draw closer. Instead of rushing forward and trying to bury the pick in her skull, however, it almost seemed to trip, the sharp head of its pick sinking into the ground a full 10 feet in front of her. Sensing her chance, Justice sprang forward to decapitate the confused zombie before it could free its weapon. But no sooner had she started moving than the ground, corrupted by some strange property of the minor zombie, began to crumble and crack as if she were walking across the shell of an egg. She threw herself to the side in a clumsy roll to escape the deep pit that was opening up beneath her. But the desperate movement ended up slamming her into a stone monument shaped like a serene angel. The impact knocked the air from her lungs, and her greatsword fell from her grip as she collapsed to the ground in a breathless heap. Justice recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. The minor zombie was upon her in an instant, and as she wrapped her hand around the hilt of her greatsword, it brought its heavy pick down toward her. She twisted just in time to prevent the weapon from piercing her heart, but not fast enough to avoid the blow entirely. The head of the pick punched through her shoulder, shattering bones and pinning her to the ground in a wave of agony. Justice grunted in pain as she tried to hack at the zombie with one hand, but the undead miner knocked the weapon aside and fell forward, its mouth opening wide to tear out her throat. Before it could finish her off, the zombie's head exploded in a shower of bone and gore. Gritting her teeth against the pain, Justice shoved the headless miner off of her, earning an explosion of pain for her trouble. Then the judge was at her side. "Hit those things," he murmured. Without hesitation, he holstered his smoking pistol, wrapped his hands around the buried pick, and yanked it free of Justice's shoulder, prompting another gasp of pain. As her blood spilled out into the fog-shrouded graveyard, Justice shoved her fingers into the small pouch on her belt. Her flesh brushed against the warm surface of the soul stones within, and with a thought, she willed the magical power they held into her body. Gradually, the pain subsided as flesh and bone knitted back together, leaving only a dull ache where agony had been moments before. With a groan, Lady Justice pulled herself back to her feet and reclaimed her greatsword. The judge and 2 other death marshals had gathered around her in a defensive circle. "They're starting to come up," the judge said, his tone calm despite the dire situation. All around them, rotting hands started to emerge from the graves. Many of the newly created undead found razor wire waiting for them, and their attempts to grab onto the sharp wire only resulted in severed fingers and hands. The marshals had been unable to spike the entire graveyard, however, and the thick mist swirled ominously around dozens of shuffling, slouched silhouettes. "Damn!" Lady Justice turned her head, spit blood onto the ground, and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. The sounds of gunfire echoed strangely through the mist, hinting at other battles elsewhere in the graveyard. "I was hoping it would take them longer to dig their way out." "That's necromancers for you," the judge grimaced. "Always full of annoying surprises like that. Want to regroup with the rest of the unit?" Lady Justice shook her head and started striding toward the nearest silhouettes with unrelenting resolve. "No, I'm not letting this bastard get away again." The judge nodded in silent agreement, and together he and the 2 death marshals fell into step behind their leader. The battle had once again been lost before it began. Nicodem had expended every last soulstone he had to boost his animation spell, spreading its energy wide across the entirety of the graveyard. He disliked having to resort to such crude work, animating corpses without first preparing and strengthening them, but desperation seemed to be the word of the day. Unfortunately, the razor wire that had been stretched out over the graves proved to be annoyingly effective at keeping his new zombies in the ground. A few had clawed their way free, with only a few missing limbs, but the vast majority of his forces were still buried shoulder-deep underground, unable to claw their way to the surface. It was exceedingly vexing. "Like they have the entire division out here," Mortimer babbled as they briskly walked. He had snatched up a shovel from a partially dug grave and was carrying it like a baseball bat. The mist started to thin out, revealing blurry, moonlit shapes. But Nicodem had no intention of strengthening the fading spell. His only priority now was to escape. 3 zombies, all of them fresh recruits from the graveyard, staggered after them, trying as best they could to keep pace with their master. Even with Nicodem's magic boosting their speed, however, the 3 undead still lagged behind their living masters. A gunshot, far louder than the other distant reports that were echoing sporadically through the graveyard, sounded behind them. Nicodem felt the bullet whiz past his ear, mere inches from the back of his head. Mortimer yelped at the gunshot and darted behind a nearby tombstone for cover. But Nicodem spun around in anger. He jabbed his hand toward his zombies, strengthening their muscles and infusing them with a short-lived burst of unwholesome vigor. As one, the 3 dead men turned and started loping toward the vague silhouettes behind them. Lady Justice met them halfway. Her greatsword cleaved through the first zombie, as if it was made from paper. And as the second lunged toward her to take advantage of the opening, she kicked out at its knee, shattering the joint. It fell over to one side, just in time for the judge to dart forward and slice downward with his own blade, decapitating the unfortunate corpse. The third zombie attempted to bite Justice, but one of the death marshals put 2 bullets into its chest, staggering it backwards. Justice took advantage of the opportunity and cleaved it from hip to shoulder. All of this took place in the span of 3 of Nicodem's heartbeats. "I really hate that woman," he murmured. He closed his eyes and reached out, trying to find more undead to draw to his side. But there were only 2 in any sort of close proximity to him. Lady Justice and the judge advanced warily, Justice moving to the left as the judge circled right. "Guild law requires that I ask you to surrender," she intoned, her greatsword held between them in anticipation of attack. "Doesn't say that we have to accept that surrender," the judge added, his expression hidden behind his mask. Nicodem grinned a malevolent smile. The guns of the death marshals roared, but they were not pointed at him. Somehow, Lady Justice realized what was happening and spun to one side, catching the bullet that should have lodged itself in the back of her head, in the cheek instead. Blood blossomed from the side of her face like a crimson flower. The judge was not so quick. The bullet caught him in the back of the head and dropped him to the ground like a sack of potatoes. The moonlight reflecting off Nicodem's glasses turned them bright white, a sharp contrast to the shadows cast by his stovepipe hat. Beyond Lady Justice, he could see her death marshals, arms extended, smoking pistols shaking in their gloved hands, fighting against his control. "No!" Blood streamed down Justice's face as she snapped around to face her men, her greatsword held defensively in front of her. "What did you do?" Nicodem chuckled softly. Neither of the marshals were fully dead, not yet, but enough of their bodies had rotted away to give him some rudimentary control over their limbs. "You really should check your death marshals more often, Ms. Justice. I believe these 2 have, for lack of a better word, spoiled." "Can't stop it." The marshal who had shot the judge slowly pivoted his gun towards her. "Please." Justice was already in motion when they fired, and their next shot screamed past her and into the night. She bared her teeth like a wild animal as she charged toward Nicodem, screaming in rage. Nicodem raised his hand and unleashed a spell of vile decay into her flesh. Her skin grew pale and gaunt as it rotted and decayed, splitting it in places to reveal the yellowing bone underneath. He had expected the spell to lock up her muscles and slow her advance, perhaps even to paralyze her on the spot. But she kept coming despite his curse, a furious juggernaut of righteous vengeance. He stepped backward as she reached him, and his mechanical leg hit a rock and sent him tumbling backwards to the ground. Justice's sword connected with his upper thigh, and in a spray of blood she severed Nicodem's artificial leg from his body. Wheezing heavily, her head lowered, Justice shoved a hand into the pouch at her side, her nearly skeletal fingers groping at the soul stones within. They were all cool to the touch, all save one. A look of pain flickered across her face, and as Nicodem tried to scramble away from her, she held the soul stone up to her lips and kissed it. "I'm sorry, my love." The glow faded from the soul stone as its healing energy poured into her, restoring color and life to her features. Freed from Nicodem's control, the death marshals began to move closer, but Justice stopped them with an outraised hand. "Your liabilities! Take the judge's body and retreat!" There were murmurs of guilty acknowledgement from the two men, but Justice wasn't paying attention to them. Despite her eyes being hidden behind her blindfold, Nicodem could almost feel the intensity of her gaze upon him. He raised his hand to defend himself with necromantic magic, but Justice's sword flashed out and lopped his arm off at the elbow. The strength left Nicodem's body as he collapsed back to the ground. He looked up at the blindfolded woman above him, and his lips pulled back into a thin, knowing smile. Do you think this will stop me? I have seen the world of the dead, and in that dark land I am a king, a great emperor of the dead." Justice's teeth ground together in hatred. "Then go there and leave us in peace, you bastard." She reversed the grip on her sword and plunged it down into Nicodem's heart. His body heaved in pain, and then again as she twisted the blade and roared out in anger. Nicodem felt himself slipping away, but this wasn't like his last death. Before, his consciousness had faded away into the darkness, but now he could feel a steady, constant tug at his soul. His eyes widened in sudden understanding, and in that moment of horror, his soul slipped away, leaving his unmoving corpse impaled on the end of Justice's sword. Screaming in anger and frustration, she beat her hand against the hilt of her sword, ramming it down further into the ground. The distant gunfire had quieted, with only the occasional report breaking the silence. After what felt like forever, Lady Justice wrenched her sword free of Nicodem's corpse and began methodically hacking it to pieces, ensuring that nothing would be left to reanimate. Once it was finished, she grabbed his head and began to slowly trudge back towards the rest of her death marshals. Her greatsword held limply in one hand as she dragged it behind her. Mortimer hid behind the tombstone for quite some time. There were few things that could get him to shut up, but watching his master get bested by the leader of the death marshals was, as it turned out, one of those things. He had hoped that Justice would leave enough of Nicodem's corpse intact for an animation spell. Seamus had brought his girl Molly back with most of her smarts intact after all. But once he had deemed it safe enough to creep closer and inspect his employer's remains, all thought of saving Nicodem left his mind. Mortimer had never been all that great at sentiment, but the weight of the moment was such that he felt compelled to say something. Feeling awkward, he removed his hat and held it over his heart as he stared down at Nicodem's remains. "Gosh, boss. Truth be told, I never thought we'd end up like this. Always thought you'd turn me into a zombie or something, to be perfectly honest. Wouldn't have been that bad of a fate for a bloke like me, right?" He paused, and for the first time found himself at a loss for words. "Well," he murmured as he shoved his hat back into place. "No use letting good pickings go to waste, right? I'm sure you wouldn't mind, eh?" With great care and practiced speed, Mortimer turned out Nicodem's pockets, collecting a few magical knickknacks, a wallet stuffed with guild scrip that he unceremoniously tucked into his coat pocket, and a handful of uncharged soulstones. Or rather, a handful of uncharged soulstones and one soulstone that glowed with a faint, somehow familiar light. Mortimer held the soulstone up to inspect it closer, and then grinned. "Looky there. Always value in going through a bloke's pockets after his death, I always say." Mortimer tossed the soulstone up into the air and caught it in a meaty fist. "Well, how about we take a visit to the sink, then? Maybe loot the old place and find something more befitting a social necromancer like myself. I figure it's about time for old Morty to be stepping up his game now. Don't you think?"
That's it for another episode of the Weird Chronicles. Join us next time for more tales of action and adventure.